Scientists tested Cleopatra's DNA, and the results didn't match what history says. They ran the test again. Same result. They brought in a second laboratory, used different extraction techniques, applied newer sequencing methods. The result didn't change. The DNA did not match the expected Egyptian lineage, not even close. For centuries, we thought we knew who Cleopatra was, the last great pharaoh, the queen of Egypt. A woman so deeply woven into the story of the ancient world that her face became the face of an entire civilization. But genetics doesn't lie, and what the science revealed about her ancestry forced researchers to ask a question nobody expected to be asking in the 21st century. Who was Cleopatra, really? Let's start with what we were taught. Cleopatra VII, born in 69 BC, last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. A woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and held the attention of the 2 most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. History painted her as Egypt's queen in every sense. Her image was carved into temple walls. Her face appeared on coins. She dressed as the goddess Isis. She performed Egyptian religious rituals. She was so tied to Egypt that, for most of history, people simply assumed she was Egyptian. But here is the thing that historians have quietly known for decades, even if it never made the headlines. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. She was the product of a dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. But that dynasty came from Macedonia. They were Greeks, foreign conquerors who had taken Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, dressed themselves in pharaoh's robes, and never fully let go. That dynasty was called the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies did something unusual, even by ancient standards. For generation after generation, they married within the family. Brother married sister, cousin married cousin. They did this to keep power consolidated, to prevent outside bloodlines from diluting their claim to the throne. The result was a royal family that had become almost entirely inbred, almost entirely Greek, almost entirely disconnected from the native Egyptian population they ruled. So, genetically speaking, Cleopatra should have looked nothing like an Egyptian. She should have been, according to the records, almost purely Macedonian Greek, except the DNA said something else entirely. To understand why this matters, you need to understand one specific gap in Cleopatra's family tree. We know who her father was. Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, the flute player, a weak ruler, a man who paid Rome enormous sums of money to keep himself on the throne. His lineage is reasonably well documented. But her mother? That's where it gets strange. History doesn't tell us who Cleopatra's mother was. Think about that for a moment. This is one of the most famous women who ever lived, and we have no confirmed record of who gave birth to her. Ancient sources mention the wife of Ptolemy XII, a woman referred to as Cleopatra V, but historians are not certain she was the mother of Cleopatra VII. Some sources suggest they were different people. Others suggest the records were deliberately incomplete. And some historians believe the mother was quietly erased from official history for reasons we still don't fully understand. A missing mother, a gap in the lineage, and DNA that doesn't match expectations. These 3 things together form the core of this mystery. But to understand what the science actually found, we need to go to a specific place, a tomb, and a set of bones that changed everything. In 1926, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Ephesus, in what is now modern-day Turkey, discovered a mausoleum unlike anything they expected to find there. Inside was the skeleton of a young woman. She had been buried with care, with some degree of ceremony. The tomb itself, while not extravagant, was not the tomb of a commoner. Someone had taken the time to lay her to rest properly. But who was she? The location provided a clue. Ephesus was where Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, had been exiled and later killed on the orders of Mark Antony at Cleopatra's request. Arsinoe had been Cleopatra's rival, her competitor for the throne. At one point, during the civil war that surrounded Julius Caesar's arrival in Egypt, Arsinoe had actually declared herself pharaoh in opposition to her sister. She'd led armies against Cleopatra, and when she lost, she was exiled to Ephesus, to the Temple of Artemis, and then, years later, she was murdered. Historians had long wondered what happened to her remains, and here, In this mausoleum in Ephesus was a young woman, buried at approximately the right time, in approximately the right place. In 1926, the skeleton was briefly examined and then largely set aside. It was the 20th century. Genetic analysis was still decades away from being possible. But in 2006, a team of Austrian researchers returned to those bones. They had new tools, they had modern forensic techniques, and they had a question that had never been properly answered. What was the ancestry of this woman? If this was Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's full sister, then her DNA would tell us something profound about Cleopatra herself. What the team found made them stop and look at each other across the lab. The skeletal analysis done by the Forensic Medicine Institute in Vienna, led by researcher Fabian Kanz, produced results that were unexpected on multiple levels. The first surprise was the age. The skeleton belonged to a girl between 15 and 18 years old. Younger than historical records suggested Arsinoe was at the time of her death, but not impossibly far off, given the imprecision of ancient documentation. The second surprise was the skull. Forensic anthropologists conducted a detailed morphological analysis of the cranial structure. They measured bone ratios, facial architecture, and the specific proportions of the skull, and what they found did not match a purely Macedonian Greek profile. The skull showed features consistent with mixed ancestry, not purely European, not purely Mediterranean. The bone structure pointed toward a lineage that included African ancestry. Let that sit for a moment. If this was Arsinoe, Cleopatra's sister, then their mother, the woman whose identity has been lost to history, may have carried African genetic heritage, and that would mean Cleopatra herself carried it too. The standard profile of Cleopatra as a purely Greek woman, the daughter of an entirely European bloodline, did not match what the bones were suggesting. The team was careful. They noted the limitations of the analysis. Morphological study of bones is not the same as DNA sequencing. The identification of the skeleton as Arsinoe was not fully confirmed. There was uncertainty at multiple levels, but the finding could not be dismissed. It demanded an explanation. And once scientists began asking the right questions, they started uncovering something much larger than a single skeleton. To understand what the DNA evidence means, you have to understand what scientists expected to find. The Ptolemaic dynasty claimed descent from Ptolemy I, a Macedonian general who served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals. Ptolemy took Egypt, and for nearly 300 years, the Ptolemies ruled there. Genetic models for this dynasty predicted a lineage that was heavily Northwestern Greek, Macedonian specifically. And with 3 centuries of inbreeding within the family, the bloodline should have remained relatively uniform. That was the expectation. The reality, when researchers began examining biological material connected to the Ptolemaic world, was more complex. Egypt in the Ptolemaic era was not an isolated kingdom. It was a crossroads. The ancient Mediterranean was a networked world. Traders, soldiers, diplomats, and slaves moved constantly between Africa, the Middle East, Greece, and Rome. Alexandria, the capital city Cleopatra ruled from, was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. And the Ptolemies, despite their self-imposed policy of family marriage, were not immune to the genetics of the world around them. Archaeological DNA studies from ancient Egyptian populations have revealed that the ancient Egyptians themselves had diverse ancestry. They showed genetic affinities with populations from the Levant, sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, in varying proportions depending on era and social class. The royal class was not isolated from this diversity. It was embedded in it. And if Cleopatra's mother was not one of the official Greek queens, if she was someone outside the documented lineage, then the genetic picture changes entirely. Here is something most people don't know about the ancient world. Women could be erased, not metaphorically, literally, their names removed from inscriptions, their images chiseled off temple walls, their existence reduced to a footnote, or nothing at all. In ancient Egypt, this practice had a name: damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. It was reserved for those who had disgraced the throne, lost a political battle, or simply become inconvenient. We know it happened to pharaohs. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's greatest female rulers, had her image and name systematically destroyed after her death, possibly by her own stepson. For centuries, historians didn't even know she had existed. Could the same thing have happened to Cleopatra's mother? Consider what we know. Ptolemy XII was not a respected king. He was known as a weak ruler, dependent on Roman money and Roman goodwill. His court was a place of constant political maneuvering. His family relationships were complicated and often violent. If Cleopatra's mother was not a legitimate Greek queen, if she was a concubine, a foreign woman, a person of mixed background whose existence would have undermined the dynasty's carefully constructed image of pure Macedonian authority, she would have been a liability. And liabilities in ancient royal courts had a way of disappearing from the record. The missing mother may not be a gap in our knowledge. It may be a deliberate deletion. And if her identity was erased, it wasn't erased by accident. Someone made a decision to remove her from history. Which raises a darker question. What else was removed? We tend to think of history as something that was simply recorded. Events happened, scribes wrote them down, and what we have today is an imperfect but essentially honest account of the past. The ancient world didn't work that way. In Egypt, history was not recorded, it was constructed. Every inscription on every temple wall was a political act. Every image carved in stone was a message, carefully designed by the ruler's scribes to project a specific version of reality. Pharaohs didn't just rule Egypt, they defined what Egypt was. They determined which battles were won, which gods were honored, which ancestors were remembered, and which ones were forgotten. Cleopatra was exceptionally good at this. She dressed as Isis. She performed rituals in ancient Egyptian language, which, in an extraordinary break from Ptolemaic tradition, she had actually learned. Every other Ptolemaic ruler had conducted affairs of state in Greek. Cleopatra was the first in nearly 300 years to speak the language of the people she ruled. This was not accidental. This was image management at the highest possible level. Cleopatra understood that power was not just military or economic. It was narrative. It was the story people told about you. And she crafted that story with extraordinary care, which means that the Cleopatra we know from ancient sources is, in part, a constructed persona, a political product, the real woman, the woman with a hidden mother, with genetic ancestry that didn't fit the official story, may have been quite different from the image that was recorded. And here is where the history becomes genuinely unsettling. There are 4 serious theories that historians and geneticists currently debate. Not one of them is definitive. All of them are grounded in real evidence. Theory 1. The purely Greek explanation. This is the most conservative reading of the evidence. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks. Cleopatra was the product of that lineage. The missing mother was simply another Greek woman whose name was lost, not erased. The skull analysis in Ephesus was inconclusive. The skeleton may not even be Arsinoe. Under this theory, Cleopatra's DNA would have shown a largely Macedonian Greek profile, and any unexpected markers would reflect the normal genetic complexity of the ancient Mediterranean world, not a hidden ancestry. This theory is clean. It fits the official record, and it may simply be correct, but it doesn't explain the skull. Theory 2. The African mother hypothesis. If the skeleton in Ephesus is Arsinoe, and if the skull morphology correctly identifies mixed ancestry with African features, then Cleopatra's mother may have been a woman of North African or Sub-Saharan African descent. This doesn't mean she was Egyptian in the traditional sense. It could mean she was Libyan, Nubian, or from the broader African world that surrounded Egypt. Women from these regions were present in the Ptolemaic court. Under this theory, the erasure of Cleopatra's mother was a deliberate suppression of ancestry that didn't fit the Greek image the dynasty wanted to project. Theory 3. Genetic drift and Mediterranean mixing. The ancient Mediterranean was not made up of clearly defined separate populations. People moved constantly. Trade routes ran across thousands of miles. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria was the most cosmopolitan place in the known world. Even within a carefully managed royal lineage, genetic mixing happens. And after nearly 3 centuries of ruling Egypt, surrounded by Egyptians at every level of society, some degree of genetic exchange between the Ptolemies and the indigenous population would be statistically expected. Theory 4. History was actively rewritten, twice. The image of Cleopatra that came down to us was not written by Egyptians or by Cleopatra herself. It was largely written by Romans, by Octavian's historians, by men who had defeated her, who had every reason to craft a specific narrative about who she was. Octavian needed Cleopatra to be a particular kind of villain, a seductress, a foreign queen, an Eastern temptress, exotic and dangerous. He did not need her to be a complex, multi-ethnic woman with legitimate political authority. The DNA doesn't care about Roman propaganda, and what the bones suggest is that the woman Rome described may have been a caricature of a far more complicated human being. Let's separate speculation from established fact. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek in origin. That much is documented and genetically supported by studies of related ancient populations. Ancient Egyptian populations were themselves genetically diverse. Studies of ancient Egyptian mummies published in peer-reviewed journals confirm ancestry from the Levant, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic picture of ancient Egypt was never monolithic. The identity of Cleopatra's mother is unknown. This is not a disputed point. It is an acknowledged gap in the historical record. The skeleton in Ephesus showed unexpected morphological features. The Austrian forensic team published their findings. The results were contested, but they were not fabricated. And the final thing we know with certainty: Cleopatra went to extraordinary lengths to present herself as a native Egyptian ruler. She spoke the language. She adopted the religion. She took on the role of a goddess. What this means is that even if the DNA had matched perfectly, it would have told us only part of the story. Because Cleopatra's identity was never simply a matter of genetics. It was a matter of choice, of strategy, and of power. Let's pull back for a moment. If a woman as famous as Cleopatra, one of the most documented figures of the ancient world, can have her mother's identity completely erased from history, what does that tell us about everything else? How many other figures had their stories quietly revised? How many battles were recorded differently than they happened? How many rulers came from backgrounds that didn't match the image they projected? The ancient world was a place where the powerful controlled information with the same intensity that they controlled armies. Scribes were not journalists. Historians were not independent. They worked for kings. They wrote what kings wanted written. This is not a fringe idea. It is consensus among academic historians. The ancient record is not a reliable, unbiased account. It is a collection of politically motivated texts produced by people with enormous stakes in the stories they told. What makes Cleopatra unusual is not that her record is incomplete. What makes her unusual is that we have enough material evidence, bones, skulls, forensic analysis, to start checking the record against physical reality. And when we do, the record doesn't quite hold. History, it turns out, is not what was recorded. It is what survived. And survival, in the ancient world, was always political. There is one more piece to this story, and it may be the most important one. We have never found Cleopatra's tomb. After her death in 30 BC, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were reportedly buried together, somewhere in or near Alexandria. Ancient sources mention the tomb. They describe it as magnificent. They say she built it herself, while still alive, as she began to realize that Rome was going to win. But the tomb has never been found. Alexandria has been built over, flooded, and rebuilt many times in the 2,000 years since Cleopatra's death. The ancient city lies partly underwater in the harbor. Earthquakes, floods, and centuries of urban development have buried or destroyed enormous portions of the ancient landscape. Several archaeologists have claimed to be close. The most prominent recent search has been led by Egyptian Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez, who has been excavating a site called Taposiris Magna, a temple complex outside Alexandria, for years. Martinez has found coins bearing Cleopatra's image. She has found artifacts consistent with Ptolemaic royal presence. She has found a network of tunnels that suggest large-scale concealed construction. But the tomb itself? Not yet. And here is what finding it would mean. If Cleopatra's body is ever recovered, if DNA can be extracted from her remains, we would have a direct answer to the question that all of this evidence is circling around. We would know, with certainty, what her ancestry actually was. Until that day, the question remains open, and the bones that have already been found suggest we should be prepared for the answer to surprise us. Here is what strikes you if you sit with this mystery long enough. Cleopatra may have known. She may have known that her ancestry was complicated, that her mother was a secret, that the official story of the pure Macedonian queen was, at least in part, a constructed image rather than a biological fact. And she chose to lean into a different identity entirely, not Greek, not the identity the Ptolemies had maintained for 300 years. She presented herself as Egyptian, as divine, as the embodiment of Isis, an ancient African goddess, the mother of gods, the protector of the dead. This was not the choice of someone clinging to a European heritage. This was the choice of someone who understood that power in Egypt came from belonging to Egypt. Whether that belonging was in her DNA or in her spirit, she made it real. She made it visible. She made it undeniable to the millions of people she ruled. And then she died, at 39 years old, with a city burning around her and an empire collapsing at her feet. And Rome got to write the ending. We tested the DNA. We brought the bones of a woman who may have been her sister into a modern laboratory. We ran the analysis. We applied forensic techniques that ancient scribes could never have imagined. And what we got was not confirmation. We got contradiction. The expected profile of a purely Macedonian Greek queen did not match what the physical evidence suggested. The missing mother left a gap that no amount of document research can fully close. The skull and ephesus pointed toward an ancestry the official record never mentioned. And Cleopatra's tomb, with the most direct evidence of all, is still buried somewhere beneath 2,000 years of sediment and sea. We tested the DNA. We expected answers. Instead, we uncovered a deeper question. The history books told us who Cleopatra was. The bones asked us to think again. And until the day someone finally opens that tomb, until the day we hold her actual remains in a sterile laboratory and run the sequencing one final time, we are left with the most honest conclusion science can offer. We don't fully know. Cleopatra may be the most famous woman who ever lived. She shaped the ancient world. She bent 2 empires to her will. She turned a foreign dynasty into something Egypt called its own. And she may still be the greatest mystery the ancient world ever left behind. Not because the records are incomplete, but because someone long ago made sure they would be.